Welcome to the Muslim Faculty of Advanced Studies Online. For more information about our programs, publications and membership, please visit our website, themuslimfaculty.org.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Wassalatu wassalamu ala ashrafil mursaleen Sayyidina Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa ashabihi ajma'in wa sallama taslima. Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to the Muslim History Program of the Muslim Faculty of Advanced Studies. This is the 7th of 12 sessions which make up the History of the Khalifa's module. The lecture will last approximately 40 minutes, during which time you should make a written note of any questions that may occur to you for clarification after the lecture. We're looking today at the Banu al Abbas, the Abbasids, the descendants of al-Mu'tasim. The further we get from the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam and the Sahaba, the more important it is to remind ourselves of how we got to this point. The companions and the Arabs of the peninsula took the deen out into the world, intending to take it to the whole world. But the demands of the newly acquired provinces, their administration and education, the challenges of the emergence of sects and other claimants to power, external threats from the humbled but unbeaten Roman Empire based in Constantinople and other forces, and their own miscalculations all led to the collapse of the power of Bani Umayyah and the emergence of Banu al Abbas as the new Khilafah. In other words, they emerged in response to an emergency or to exceptional circumstances. We note only Carl Schmitt's maxim, "Sovereign is he who decides on the exception." With a lessening of the stress on the importance of taking the deen to the world, the Abbasids, if we use this term not only for the ruling elite but for the Ummah at that time, begin to look inwards, and that has many positive results, most particularly in the clarification and elaboration of knowledge of the deen and the flowering of culture and civilization. Two concepts that stem from roots linked etymologically to cult, with its meaning of worship and cultivation, and to civil society, as opposed to fighting and warfare. Civil society with its inherent overtones of both politics and courtesy. However, they extended the outward realm in one substantial dimension. Al-Mu'tasim, who lived from 218 to 227 of the Hijrah, who is the head of the dynasty that now stretches before us right up until its end and the handing over of the Khilafah to the Osmani in Istanbul, he moves his capital to Samarra, north of Baghdad, as we saw last week, and closer to what is today called Turkey, in order to avail of the Turks who had migrated westwards from their homeland in Asia as new troops to substitute for the Khurasanis who were lost to the Khilafah as the price of the fourth fitna, the civil war between Al-Amin and Al-Ma'mun. The inclusion of the Turks is an admission of new peoples to the deen and to the dawla. Their entrance is at first unruly, and they, in combination with the various forces within the dawla, sometimes contribute substantially to or even create dynastic struggles within the dawla, dynastic struggles with their fratricides and patricides. The Turks will in time themselves become distinguished dynasties underneath the umbrella of the dawla. Among them, the Mamluks of Cairo and, of course, the Osmanli dawla. A fateful step is taken just a decade later by Al-Wathiq, who lived from 227 to 232 of the Hijrah, who in the year 228 appoints one of the Turks, Ashnas, as the Sultan. and in the future it will often be a real issue to try and understand who is actually in power, the Khalifa or the Sultan. But the answer is often simple, the Sultan. And the Khalifa retires effectively to the role of Pope. However, later powerful figures will pull the Khilafah back from this brink. This is with respect to last week's lecture. Now, from the period that we're looking at today, other key elements of the age announced themselves early on. The Zanj Rebellion, named after the races of East Africa who had been enslaved and who apparently worked, unusually for Muslim slavery, on plantations in Iraq. Yet, this rebellion is headed by one who names himself Muhammad ibn Ali and who tries unsuccessfully to convince people of his Shia pretensions, and having failed in that, manifests his true colours. He is a type of Khawarij. The movement displays many of the typical marks of the Khawarij: ignorant, indiscriminate slaughter of all and sundry, but lacks the extreme piety of that group. Then, almost immediately upon the suppression of this movement, the next appears. Ubaydullah ibn Ubayd emerges in the Yemen, claiming to be the Mahdi. He calls himself Ubaydullah ibn al-Hussein ibn Ahmad ibn Abdullah ibn Muhammad ibn Ismail ibn Jafar, meaning Jafar as-Sadiq, radiyallahu anhu, thus claiming to be a descendant of Fatima, radiyallahu anha. Al-Baqilani, who is one of the great ulama of Aqidah, says that his ancestry is from the Persian Majus, in other words, Zoroastrians. And few people of knowledge seriously accept the claim of the Fatimiyin to Sharif ancestry. But it is a call he persists in for 8 years in the Yemen. Then he goes on Hajj and meets Hajjis from Kutama of the Amazigh. The Amazigh is the name these people call themselves, whom others call the Berber. And he moves west with them to the Maghrib, which becomes the basis of his power and the establishment of a dynasty that will have much impact on the Muslims. Then there are even more trials. A group known in English as the Carmathians appear in 278 of the Hijrah in Bahrain, not the island known by that name today, but one of the powerful Arab kingdoms facing that island on the mainland. And they endure for almost a century until 370 of the Hijrah. In Arabic, they are called Al-Qaramita. As-Suyuti calls them Mulhidun, which encompasses deviating from the right course, disputing and despising. Modern Arabs use the same word for atheists. As-Suyuti says that they denied the need for ghusl after sexual relations, considered wine halal, added to the adhan, and Muhammad ibn al-Hanafiya is the messenger of Allah. They added this to the adhan, and said that there were only 2 days to fast in the year, both of them being pre-Islamic Persian religious festivals, and that the Bayt al-Maqdis was the Qibla, to which the Hajj should also be made. What should be noted about the Fatimiyin and the Qaramita is that they both devolve from the Ismaili line of Shi'ism and are Batinis. The essence of that philosophy is that they deny the outward meaning of the revelation, although they are content to leave the Zahir as an exotericism, for which they supply the Batin, the esoteric. Not accidentally, historians of Freemasonry find surprising similarities between the two groups. In the year 333 of the Hijrah, exactly 1100 years ago, A ruler from Persia called Ahmed ibn Buwayh seizes the Sultanate in Baghdad, and to all intents and purposes, the Khilafah has itself become Shia. For our continuing theme of the best man versus the optimum man politically, the Batini groups undoubtedly consider an aspect of the best man to be his spirituality, which includes his kashf, unveiling of spiritual realities. But they go so far in this direction that they are willing to consider unveilings that flagrantly contradict the revelation. Yet, throughout this same era, there had been a vibrant spiritual activity which is in harmony with and in submission to the revelation and the Sharia, that of the movement whose major figure is Imam al-Junaid, who lives from the year 221 to 297 of the Hijrah. I do not mention it here arbitrarily, but because the Batini movement wreaks such havoc politically that it must be that there's great political significance to this other quiet movement. We do not call it quietist, because these men are not withdrawn from the world, but are a part of the age and its concerns. So I touch on this theme to alert you to it. It's not something to ignore. While the Karamita have a limited lifespan, during which they undoubtedly wreak much havoc, making off with the black stone itself at one point, which they also managed to break into several pieces. Yet the Fatimiyin are destined to move from strength to strength, first establishing a capital in Mahdiya on the coast of Tunisia, from which they rule the entire North Africa, finally taking Cairo itself, which is to be their capital, making further inroads so that they have rulership of much of Sham, East Africa, Hijaz, and even Mecca and Medina, and even on occasion wielding power in Baghdad itself. Their existence extends from the 909 of the Christian era to 1171. Thus, for most of the Abbasid Dawla, the Fatimiyin are the dialectical opposite that almost overwhelms them, depriving them of the West and underscoring the Eastern Oriental nature of the Abbasid Dawla. So let us hazard something here. In our fourfold analysis that posits a best man thesis, an optimum political man thesis, the impatience of pious ignorance and arrogance, the Khawarij, and the quiet retreat from conflict of the people of knowledge, let us posit that when Banu al Abbas rode the lion of the best man thesis into the camp of the optimal man and overthrew the Umayyads, they necessarily had to become what they had overthrown. What revolution in history has not overthrown a dictator only to become in turn dictatorial? So the Abbasids are the absolute continuation of the Umayyads in every way, even down to their alienation from the descendants of Sayyidina Ali ibn Abi Talib radiallahu anhu, and in their persecution of his descendants. Thus, by adopting the role of the politically optimal man, they leave open the candidacy of the best man, and that is promptly taken up by the Fatimiyin, the Fatimids. Their dynasty, however, the Fatimiyin, being in reality just another political dynasty, is limited by the natural lifespans of dynasties which extend to 3 or 4 generations. And this takes us to the eve of the Crusades. We saw before how the first jihad came up against the martial spirit of the Franks under Charles Martel, and how, after the defeat at the Battle of Tours, the Muslims slowly retreated back over the Pyrenees to what was then known as Al-Andalus, which is known to us today as Spain. Thus, with the setting in place of more settled borders between Islam and Christendom, and with Constantinople, a seemingly impenetrable barrier to the northwest, and the route to the north through the Caucasus barred by the Turkic Khazar, then Europe is left to simmer and to brew an identity not just not Muslim, but being a specifically European kind of Christian, not really like the other Oriental Christians, such as the Romans in Constantinople, or the other almost completely heathen, in their eyes, heathen Christians living throughout the Muslim lands and in many ways seemingly almost indistinguishable from Muslims. Then an element is mixed in this otherwise quite parochial mix, and that is Viking blood, which comes in via the Norse who have settled in Normandy, the Normans. Very quickly they take the British Isles and even Muslim Sicily, but they have several serious issues. First, they have taken on inheritance by primogeniture. Adam Smith, in his book An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations, explains the origin of primogeniture in Europe in the following way. When land was considered as the means not of subsistence merely, but of power and protection, it was thought better that it should descend undivided to one. In those disorderly times, every great landlord was a sort of petty prince. His tenants were his subjects. He was their judge, and in some respects their legislator in peace and their leader in war. He made war according to his own discretion, frequently against his neighbours and sometimes against his sovereign. The security of a landed estate, therefore, the protection of which its owner could afford to those who dwelt on it, depended on its greatness. To divide it was to ruin it, and to expose every part of it to be oppressed and swallowed up by the incursions of its neighbours. The law of primogeniture, meaning inheritance of the first son to the exclusion of other sons and daughters. The law of primogeniture therefore came to take place, not immediately indeed, but in process of time, in the succession of landed estates, for the same reason that it is generally taken place in that of monarchies, though not always at their first institution. This system may have had its logic, but it had its inherent weaknesses, and that we can call the second and third son problem. In a culture not known for its meek character or for its celibacy, what does one do with the disinherited the second, third, fourth, and fifth sons? What do you do with them? If you keep them at home, you can expect all sorts of trouble. The answer worried a lot of people greatly until Pope Urban solved it with his call for the First Crusade. A hidden and shadowy part of the Crusades is the role of the Italian bankers who bankrolled the Crusaders. Thus, financed by usurious loans and driven by the need to find their fortunes elsewhere and not cause trouble at home, the motley crew of adventurers, ne'er-do-wells, dine-and-outs, and pious pilgrims worked their way towards Jerusalem, first despoiling the Jews of Europe, and then the Jews and the Christians of the Holy Land. A later crusade sacked Constantinople itself, whose cries for help had reputedly launched the Crusades in the first place, a sacking from which it never really recovered. Sir Stephen Runciman, historian of the Crusades, wrote that the sack of Constantinople is unparalleled in history. He says, "For 9 centuries, the great city had been the capital of Christian civilization. It was filled with works of art that had survived from ancient Greece and with the masterpieces of its own exquisite craftsmen. The Venetians seized treasures and carried them off to adorn their town, but the Frenchmen and Flemings were filled with a lust for destruction. They rushed in a howling mob down the streets and through the houses, snatching up everything that had glittered and destroying everything they could not carry, pausing only to murder or to rape or to break open the wine cellars. Neither monasteries nor churches nor libraries were spared. In Santa Sofia itself, drunken soldiers could be seen tearing down the silken hangings and pulling the great silver iconostasis to pieces, while sacred books and icons were trampled underfoot. While they drank merrily from the altar vessels, a prostitute set herself on the patriarch's throne and began to sing a ribald French song. Nuns were ravished in their convents. Palaces and hovels alike were entered and wrecked. Wounded women and children lay dying in the streets. For 3 days, the ghastly scenes continued till the huge and beautiful city was a shambles. When order was restored, citizens were tortured to make them reveal the goods that they had contrived to hide. But wait, what is this movement in essence? Why, it is the classical picture of the Khawarij, extremely pietistic, yet easily condemning others as infidels and easily resorting to slaughter in an appalling manner. Nevertheless, this incursion into the Ummah will still accomplish something of the duty that the Muslims themselves owe the world, just as in the case with the Turks, because these invaders, in spite of everything, do take something back with them, along with the booty and the cultural artifacts and the pleasure in the sophisticated living of the Arabs. They bring back an aroma. They may also have brought back some of the common law, and they will come back for more, but that is subject for another time. And the Khilafah has settled into a sort of routine. Mostly it is divided into petty kingdoms with some nominal acknowledgement of the Khalifa, but certainly no monetary or military support. Thus we understand the failure of the Muslims as a whole to respond to this incursion. For rather it is Kurds, Nur ad-Din Zengi, Shirkuh, and the more famous Salah ad-Din al-Ayyubi, who take up the challenge and see it through, and for their pains, they too become a dynasty. It happens during the reign of one majestic Khalifa, one of the periods of the strength that light up this long epoch, but nevertheless, the Khilafah, the Ummah, cannot react as a whole. A part takes up the challenge. What is the structure of things at this point? We had seen before the tip of an iceberg in our tale of the Barmakis, an ancient family who before Islam had been administrators and who are after Islam splendid administrators. They understand something vital that the monarchs do not: revenues and balance sheets. The monarchs are more concerned for lavishing dinars on poets for a fine couplet. But where do those golden dinars come from? The wazir knows the answer, and he makes it his business to ensure a steady supply. But of course, much as the Khalifa has a need for those dinars, the various subsidiary amirs and kings also have needs, and it is not too surprising that after some time they will find ways not to send the dinars to the Khalifa. And thus the integrity of the Ummah is broken, and each dynasty has its own vortex of funds in which the dinars circulate without reaching the Khalifa. And that, coupled with the failure to supply fighting men to the center is workable, but it means that the Ummah does not think like a whole, but each part thinks on its own behalf. Similarly, with dynastic inheritance, the mothers of the children of the Khulafa quite naturally want their own particular son on the throne. And if they are particularly charming or engaging, their husbands want very much to please them. And this will result in quite addle-headed young men being placed in situations of responsibility that they are certainly not up to, while much more competent men languish in dungeons or in remote provinces plotting to regain their throne at the cost of the march of armies and the clash of arms and the death of peoples. I'll mention one particular strength at this point, particularly to do with the women who are the mothers of the Khalifas, because Europe, in its insistence on royal ancestry for the mothers of the children, will gradually and inexorably sink into a kind of senility of the royal lines. But almost invariably, the mothers of the Khalifas are slave women from remote Muslim lands, bringing in new DNA and new strengths to the ruling family. Clearly, what has been lost in this picture by all concerned is the sense of responsibility before Allah for the inheritance of His deen and its transmission to the human race. Sometimes there are noble attempts at some of that. But for example, one noble man eager to emulate Omar ibn Abdulaziz does so in Omar's zuhud and piety, but not in his polity and restoration of the fiqh. He does not last very long, and although neither did Omar, he did actually accomplish a great deal in a very short time. All of this comes to a head in the next phase after the Crusaders have been sent home. There is nothing that could prepare anyone for what happens next. The Khilafah at this point, after a period of power and might, under a majestic Khalifa, An-Nasir Lidinillah, has after some time with his brothers Al-Zahir and Al-Muntasir, through various palace and dynastic intrigues, fallen into the hands of a man, Al-Muntasir's son, Al-Musta'asim, who would rather play and entertain himself, while his uncle Khafaji had openly stated his desire to go and thrash the Tatar. Out of the east, in a very short period of time, this new force emerges, and quite ruthlessly they sweep through straight to the west, devastating everything on their way. The Tatar, known to us as the Mongols. Energized and united by a most remarkable man, Genghis Khan, a man convinced that he has a destiny before heaven to rule earth, all of it. They sweep westwards. Their war on the Muslims is moreover not a war against Allah, but in their eyes, the war of Allah, to punish the Muslims because they have betrayed Islam, which they articulate quite clearly. Quickly, they gather from the populace before the butchery, the learned, the pious, the artists and craftsmen, and then they put the rest to the sword. They take Baghdad, according to most of the historians, with the connivance of a treacherous Shia wazir called Al-Alqami, who wishes with their help to erect a Shia Dawla, although the Tatars' own Muslim historian repudiated that. Nevertheless, he did serve them for some short period in a way as a kind of humiliated wazir, dying shortly afterwards. But the Tatar rolled the Khalifa himself in a rug in order not to spill his blood and trample him to death with their horses. Ibn Juzay says in his Al-Qawanin al-Fiqhiyya, then there was Al-Mu'tasim, and he was the last of them. He was killed in Baghdad in 656. The number of their khulafa was 37, and the period of their rule was 524 years. So his name was Musta'asim. My mistranslation, not Ibn Juzay's mistake. 2 years after this, in the year 658 of the Hijrah, Baybars, the Mamluk Sultan of Cairo, under a titular Abbasid survivor, sweeps out with the Egyptian army and defeats the Mongols, the Tatar, at the battle called Ain Jalut. And this battle has enormous significance because people had come to believe that they were simply invincible. They could not be defeated. And here the story ends, according to most historians, except that one important coda is the entry into Islam before the end of a century of groups of the Tatar, and then more and more and more. But this is the end of the Abbasid Dawla. There are dissenting views, but they are a minority, including As-Suyuti himself, which is that the Dawla persisted in Cairo. There are few survivors of the carnage wreaked. One Abbasid escapes to Sham and is proclaimed Khalifa, and another to Cairo, where he is acclaimed Khalifa. And then the former submits to the latter, and to all intents and purposes, there is now a Khalifa in Cairo, except that few historians count him as such. Why? Because the Khalifas had become simply highly honoured, and sometimes not so highly honoured, prisoners of the Mamluk dynasty. But what has died is the very idea of an Abbasid Khilafah. That particular mystique and semi-sacred ambience that surrounded them has simply died. Except for a few diehards in Egypt, such as Suyuti himself, who lived the myth through to the very end. But surprisingly, a Suyuti who lives right to the very end of the Cairo branch, there are only 2 more Khulafa after him, comes to inhabit a world with a very reduced horizon. In spite of his living to the end of the 15th Christian century, he makes no mention in his history either of the fall of Granada in 897 of the Hijrah, 1492 of the Christian era, which most historians recognize as an epochal loss, or the much earlier fall of Constantinople to the Muslims in 857 of the Hijrah, 1453, a transition that the Muslims had striven earnestly for almost 8 centuries. So inescapably, after all the vicissitudes of the Abbasids, they're alternating between being impotent papal figures dominated by their sultans and their wazirs, and genuinely powerful figures such as one of the very last, An-Nasr. We come to the first interregnum in our history, at the end of the Abbasids until the beginning of the Osmanli Dawla. The Osmanli, in this interim, had begun to speak about themselves as Khulafa and their capital as Dar al-Khilafa. Professor Mehmed Makhzurlu writes, when Sultan Murad sent a Humayun, a letter, to the sovereign of the Karaman Emirate on the 1st of Rabi'a Thani, 767 of the Hijrah, the 16th of December 1365, he referred to his capital Bursa as Darul Khilafa, seat of the Khilafah. That is a reality with the Osmanis. But careful as they are to pay heed to the form, in 923 of the Hijrah, 1517 of the Christian era, Selim I, after conquering Egypt, receives the last Abbasid al-Mutawakkil in Istanbul, who transfers the Khilafah to him and to the House of Osman. That brings us to the end of today's lecture. I recommend that you continue to study Jalaluddin as-Suyuti, his work Tarikh al-Khulafa, which in English is called History of the Caliphs, pages 372 to 547, and as support for the whole course, continue your study of Chapter 3 of Ibn Khaldun's Muqaddimah on the power issues involved. The subject of our next lecture is the Khilafah of Bani Umayyah in Al-Andalus, but there is no particular recommended reading for that. Thank you for your attention. Assalamu alaikum.